Alrighty, and we are live. Yep. Alrighty, so this is episode 3 of MEDSec and DFear, Lunch and Learn, featuring myself again, Michael Verdi, and...
Hi, I'm Kaya Overholtzer. You guys saw me at the first MEDSec and DFear Lunch and Learn. Ian and I kind of are going to pass off every other week. My turn is up.
Let's go. Alright, so again, Michael Verdi. My LinkedIn is up here. I'm a fourth year cybersecurity student at Champlain College. I am the MEDSec summer intern for ComCode, and my backgrounds are in, SOC tasks, networking, hardware, penetration testing, system and software development.
Hi, I'm Kaya Overholtzer. I am a rising senior at Champlain College. My major is in computer and digital forensics with a minor in criminal law. I am the DFear summer intern along with Ian Eubanks. His information is also there on the side. My background's in mobile device repair, advanced data recovery, forensic analysis, system administration. So first things first, we're going to get a little into DFear. So today I want to talk about kind of the pinnacle of digital forensics, which is the imaging process. So for those of you who don't know, imaging kind of at its core is taking a copy of whatever data you want to look at and then analyzing it. The whole point of an image is that you have a separate copy to work on versus the original, so that you know it's forensically sound. Should you need to go back and prove that you didn't change anything, you didn't plant evidence, you didn't compromise the investigation in any way. So you work off of this copy and you do your analysis. There's basically 3 different types of imaging. There's the logical acquisition, which is basically when you just go in and you make a copy of all the files. You move them over on the drive and you look at basically just the files. That includes, the file system, the operating system, your Word docs, your PDFs, your emails, browser history. But it's basically just a copy of the content up there. The other type of forensic imaging is the physical acquisition. This is when you would, typically shut down a computer, you pull out the hard drive, you plug in this little, that's like cable that you then plug into a separate machine to image. Basically what this does is it makes like a bit by bit perfect identical copy of the drive that you're taking a copy of. This is great because it's identical. This also includes like deleted files and any kind of things existing within like the slack space or empty areas of a drive. So should somebody decide to, try to cover their tracks by deleting things, it was just yesterday. If you have a physical image, you can usually go back through and look in like the open space in a drive and be like, that's where the deleted files were, that's how they hid the evidence. So in forensics, physical acquisition is like the golden standard. In a perfect world, you'd always want to have a physical copy of a drive because it would allow you total freedom of seeing basically everything physically possible in that image. Obviously, logical acquisition does have its standard, and there's a reason why I am talking about it, which I will go over here in a second. But this is kind of, the gist and the basics of the kind of the methodologies and the reasons why you would do certain types of imaging.
Now, you said that physical acquisition is like the golden standard. How would you do that remote?
That's what I'm going to be talking about. And one other thing, there's technically a third type of acquisition. It's not considered imaging, but it's just like, people are sending suspicious emails, so you literally go into the computer, you just take a copy of the emails. That is a thing. It's not technically imaging because you're not taking a full copy. And it's often used in more instant response cases than criminal cases, but that is also something that is often done. So I guess it was been a month ago now. I talked to you guys about kind of the scenario and this idea that there's 20,000 employees, there's 200 offices, everybody's spread around the globe. Practically, you can't send your forensic analysts to every single company site and have them sit there pulling out hard drives and imaging things. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of resources. It's extremely impractical and is just not something that gets done. So of course, if you need to do this, you typically go to remote acquisition. Remote acquisition, pretty straightforward. That's I'm sure you guys have heard about it. You sit there, you remote into a computer, take control of it, and you make a copy of it. Although this is kind of the golden standard now for incident response, especially in such a large case as this one, it does have some limitations. The biggest one obviously being that physical imaging is not possible in remote acquisition. So logical acquisition, you can only get things that the file system or the operating system sees. The file system, the operating system cannot see deleted files. So when you're doing remote acquisition, you are going to lose out on seeing seeing deleted files and seeing anything in that slack space or anything that doesn't exist to the operating system, which is a letdown. The other thing is I don't know how familiar everyone is with hardware RAIDs. Basically, RAIDs is just when you plug in a bunch of hard drives together to get extra speed and extra capacity. But hardware RAIDs, they're all connected together physically in a system, basically. You can't do, I don't want to say it's technically impossible, but logical acquisition of hardware RAIDs gets a little complicated because you lose out on a lot of important information due to the way that hardware RAIDs store their metadata physically in the firmware of the hardware RAID versus something they share with the operating system, so you do lose out on that.
I think Ian had a question.
Yeah.
Is system memory included in the imaging process?
Yeah, so I believe Ian's referring to RAM, so random access memory. That's the thing that, when you're using your computer, it saves where you were in your Word doc, it saves what tabs you're looking at. Basically, anything currently in use in that computer gets thrown into the RAM so that you can access it quicker. So RAM is kind of an interesting point because it's a newer consideration within the DFIR community. Obviously, people have understood the importance of RAM, of getting a full picture. But the whole point of forensics is to leave things as untouched as possible. You don't want to, like I said earlier, corrupt, plant, or in any way disturb the original copy. And the only way to get a RAM image is live imaging, which I was going to talk about. So basically, in order to get a RAM image, you have to install something on the computer to get it, which then kind of breaks the forensic best practice, guidelines. So RAM imaging, although it is becoming more prevalent and more something that is being prioritized now, it's not always captured when you go through and you do the initial imaging process. The other thing about RAM is that the second you turn off a computer, all that data is basically lost. And so if you are in a situation where somebody freaks out and pulls the plug, that data is basically not able to be rescued. There have been some interesting studies into people turning off a machine and throwing RAM into liquid nitrogen, freeze spray, or even putting it into an ice bath to maintain its integrity. And there has been some evidence that within about an hour, if you throw it in liquid nitrogen, for example, you can recover 99% of things that are on the RAM. But clearly it's not practical for examiners to throw every piece of hardware into liquid nitrogen every time they do a forensic investigation.
Now, when they're doing these investigations, you said that, if you're going to get RAM, you have to install something. I'd imagine that means that, in an emergency situation, that there is leeway to, best practices, forensic stuff. Where does that leeway stop?
Yeah, so I guess just to be completely transparent, if you didn't put it together, I'm a very criminal kind of backgrounded person versus a traditional incident response, which is what this internship is. So I do kind of have to work to break away from some of these thoughts of no bad process is good. So really what it comes down to is that in an emergency situation, the rules are meant to be broken. It's not, if you take it to court and say the only way to get an encryption password, for example, there's forms of malware that only exist in RAM and won't show up any other part of your PC. So the only way to analyze that or to prove there was malware is to take that image. So it's one of those things that's really a scenario by scenario thing. But there are times where you kind of have to throw forensic best practices to the wind in order to capture information that wouldn't otherwise be able to be captured.
So it's a case-by-case basis.
Yes. Particularly incident response, because a company who's losing, $1 billion an hour is going to be much more likely to say, like, you can do whatever you want to our systems as long as we stop, hemorrhaging money.
That's fair. And I see here you have limitations on bandwidth and company resources. Now, is there like a certain priority when imaging a system that you want to get first? Like, do you want to get the RAM first, or do you want to get the hard drive first if you only have X amount of resources?
So the first thing you want to do is you want to get the RAM. Because like I said, computer, even certain times, if your computer goes into hibernation long enough, you lose what's in the RAM. So RAM should always be prioritized. It's the first thing that if you need it, you need to get it. So my kind of bullet point there was more on the fact that, in this particular scenario, you were doing things completely remote. You do not have access to anything. So you have to trust that the company sets up like, the remote desktop correctly. Yeah. That you have the ability to remote in, that you have the permissions you need while remoted in to be able to do these things. However, if the company, is not, Fortune 500 company or whatever, and they don't have the resources, it becomes very tricky. If they only have one IT guy running the whole show, he can't go set up remote desktop immediately on 20,000 computers. If the company doesn't have great internet in a rural area, it's going to take you forever to move petabytes potentially of information over the line back to some kind of centralized storage unit. So these are just kind of like, so this list, although not labeled, perhaps I should have been a little more clear, is kind of all the things that can go wrong or that complicate this remote thing in a DFIR case as large as this. Because, you're not going to get your full hardware rate images. Yeah. You're probably going to throw a lot of forensic considerations to the wind, and you probably could potentially be waiting days, for images to transfer for you to even analyze, which then, company loses more money, they get more angry at you, but you can't exactly go and install fiber lines for them either.
Can't just build a new network for them. All right. It's a lot, especially for like now with the pandemic. It's a lot of things you gotta.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact statistic, but a bunch of people, Kaspersky, Norton, all the people who do like the threat landscape kind of reports monthly or quarterly. Yeah. Malware, ransomware, and other various hacking attempts have grown by like 350% since the beginning of COVID. Between people working at home, you know, not caring, or, they didn't have time to properly implement security practices or standards. So this has just kind of grown tenfold. A lot of this stuff, although our scenario is, a scenario we kind of made it up, kind of being like the worst case scenario we can almost think of. It is not, completely fictional. A lot of that was based upon our conversations with, ComCode and other industry professionals who've said like, yeah, this is what we're dealing with and it's not fun. Which is kind of the whole point of this project, is being like, okay, so obviously this is not ideal, but what are all the considerations that one has to make when dealing with it? Such as, these.
Well, it's good that your project's looking at this, especially as, I know a lot of companies are staying remote now, so it's good to have a plan.
Yes, anyone who wants to go in remote, instant response, this is definitely the time to get involved. There's definitely money to be made and things to be discovered in this realm.
All right, well, thank you. Now we're on to MEDSec, and this week I'm going to be discussing what I've been doing, which is the entire process of classifying a device, which it's a lot. Yeah, it's a lot. So I'm going to try to condense it for this video. So here we have just a general chart of device classification in both the US and the EU, which are the two areas I focused on. Both of these are, as the arrows show, a risk-based classification. So the higher the risk, the higher the class. And with that higher risk comes more scrutiny from regulatory bodies, more specific, general controls you have to implement on your device, more plans you have to lay back, behind the scenes, like an IR plan for some devices, different, monitoring of networks and monitoring of the field in general, like what new vulnerabilities come up. Just a whole bunch of different systems and controls that you have to implement. Like for one, in both the US and EU, which is one thing that they share, is if it's above a class 1 device, you have to have access control. If you don't have some sort of access control, you just straight up can't sell the device whatsoever. At all. Like, if you don't have a username and password minimum, you're done.
What's an example of a class 1 device? And just to give everyone kind of an idea of what were the categories here.
So a class 1 device is, low risk if it fails. Usually that's something like your gloves are technically a device.
Okay.
So it's really low class. If your glove fails, the patient's not going to die. It's inconvenient, could lead to, something bad, but on its own is not going to kill the patient.
Okay, so device then in this context does not mean like electronic or technical. It just literally means anything used in the medical field. Device. Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah, then you have class 2 in the US, which comes close to like, your syringes that, if they break, you're going to lose medicine, or medicine's not going to be administered correctly, which could kill. That's like medium risk. Or in the EU, they split it up into 2A and 2B. So a syringe would be 2A because it's low to medium risk. 2B would be like a CAT scan machine. Like, because if that does it wrong, you're going to misdiagnose something, which you can fix, but it is, still relatively medium to high risk. Any of your class 3 devices, which are like, if this fails, the patient could die or be irreparably, harmed. So this is where your like pacemakers come in, your different, like brain scan, surgical equipment, the like electronic ones that like, monitor health or something like that. That's where the class 3 comes in. That's where all the heavy duty, regulations and controls need to be implemented. So the process. I'm going to go through a test case and explain each part. So first, you have to, what is your device? So let's say it's a pacemaker, right? It's a pacemaker, you implant it on the heart, regulates the beat, and it has, an app that you can control like the pace or the status of the device. So now you figure that out. What purpose does it serve? It's a pacemaker, regulates your heart. If that fails, you die. If, your pacemaker starts going off, you have serious harm. If the pacemaker doesn't connect correctly, can't control it, you die. So, it's a life-saving device. Then, what form does the device take? Is it a physical device, like as you actually implant it? Or is it just like a piece of software? Is it one you wear outside your chest, like, some weird patch? Or do you actually have to get surgery and have it attached to your heart? Once you figure that out, if it's in your heart, that increases your risk because it's inside your body, and if that fails, it's failing in you. But if it's on the outside, that lowers the risk slightly because you can just take it off, and it, is not as essential. It's not in vitro, as they say. Okay,
so, for example, I know you're using pacemakers. I don't know enough about pacemakers to necessarily word this. I'll use a different device. It's something like a prosthetic.
Yeah.
I know that they vary because certain ones I know have like full Bluetooth capabilities. You can see your stats on your phone. You can control tension. All that kind of cool stuff. But there's also prosthetics still in use from 30 years ago, which clearly don't have Bluetooth.
Yeah.
But are still doing their thing because it's a tested and well-known technology. So for these two things, would they still go in like the same class, or do they get differentiated because one's actually like a cybersecurity risk versus the other one's like a physical risk?
It depends. So like in the US, it's a little bit more device by device. So like the FDA has a database that you can actually look up different devices. If you type in pacemaker, there's a device that's classified as a pacemaker, but it's only a class 1 device, while at the same time there's one that's a class 3. So it very much depends on the device in the U.S. and where it goes on you, what it's encompassed in that, device, how you're categorizing it. It depends on what body systems it interacts with, what the environment it's going to be in, stuff like that. In the EU, it's a little bit more general. So like, it does it, if you have a prosthetic, does it go on your knee? Well, you can operate and live without your knee. So your knee prosthetic is going to be less of a risk than, you're like a spinal prosthetic or like a, chest to keep your body, not from, failing. I don't know a lot about medical conditions, but you get the point. Yeah. It's, where it is and what harm could happen if it fails.
So do the United States and Europe, do they talk about these things, or are they just kind of completely doing their own thing? Or is there some uniformity in that, like, we agree this is really important, so we're both going to classify this way, or is it like a
They share a lot of definitions, like what a medical device is, what a software as a medical device is, what an accessory to a medical device is. They each have their own system of regulating it. Like the U.S. Defers to NIST and ISO. The EU also uses ISO, but they have their own regulatory body for medical devices. But there are non-governmental organizations or government-adjacent organizations that assist in this, like the IMDRF, the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, is basically a UN for medical devices, where they put out like definitions, like this is what a software is, and the US and EU go, we'll take that. That's our definition. Or these are the way you can categorize risk, and the US will be like, we like A through Y, but we don't like this part, so we're just not going to include it.
Okay, so basically, it's not obviously I know the government has a lot to do with regulations, but a lot of it though is coming from like the private scientific community and their findings versus the government, which isn't always the best about being on top of new technology.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, they both take pointers from both. Like the FDA, even on their website, is like medical devices are changing so quickly that we recommend you go to the IMDRF for the latest security, and they release guidances. Like, these aren't hardcore requirements, but it's better if you have them.
Yeah, okay.
Because, like, the post-market device system that the FDA has, their most recent one was published in 2014, which is binding. You have to follow it. But they've released a guiding document in 2018 that's under review that changes the whole system of how they're going to, secure a device, but it's only recommended. So it's like, you should do this, but if you don't, we're not going to be like, good job, you didn't do it, but we're going to be like, okay, you can still get it.
Okay.
So it kind of, it's a lot of third parties involved. So anyways, back to the scenario. As I said, what could happen if the device fails? Will you die? Then it's class 3 immediately. Will you not die? Will your quality of life decrease? Yeah, a little bit. Okay, now you're in class 2. Will your quality of life decrease? Like, you're going to lose a leg? Yeah? Okay, now you're in 2A. It decreases as in, you can't go to work for like a week? Now you're in 2B. Well, if the device fails, you can just replace it immediately. Like, if my glasses break, I can't see. But I'm not going to die. So it would be class 1. So it really, very much is based on the risk to the patient should the device not perform as intended. The next step is, once you figure that out, so a pacemaker, it's class 3 because it's implanted, what protections are needed? Okay, so what risks are there? The battery could die. It could, fail if you're like moving around too much and, you get hit the wrong way or something and it pops off your heart. I guess I don't know how they attach devices to your heart, but, you get, if it, moves out of place. Does it connect to your phone? Well, now if you get a virus on your phone, is that going to spread to your pacemaker? And now your pacemaker is held by ransomware and you can't breathe. Do you connect to it through a Google, web portal? Like, you go on your computer and go, pacemaker.com/Mike's pacemaker, and now I can change the settings. Well, now if Google gets hacked, they get, your data on that. If your browser's, caught, now that, you have to prepare your pacemaker to not receive Google requests that are not designed to be there. Does it have to get firmware updates from the manufacturer? Well, if it has to use remote code to update itself, well, now you need to get that signed so that, someone can't just hijack it and, pull solar winds. And next thing you know, your pacemaker is, hosting Russian spyware or something. So you need to generate all these, figure out where all the risks are, through either pen testing or just analysis or some method that you have to have documented. And you need to have controls to protect from that. So, signed updates. Only receiving messages that are, authorized by a certain user. Username and password. Encryption. Backup. Fail safes that, if one part of the, pacemaker doesn't move, the whole thing's not going to collapse immediately. There'll be some time for the, get it worked out, get it fixed. Having a third party monitor it. Some hospitals do monitor pacemakers while they're in the patients. Make sure that they're secure. But you can't cover them all. So this is where, you have to apply these regulations and then figure out what they have for afterwards. A lot of both the EU and US have frameworks that you need to have in place for your post-market introduction. So, you need to monitor the landscape. Is there a new Google vulnerability? Well, now you need to make sure your pacemaker portal's not going to get hacked by this vulnerability. Does it just run on Windows? Does Windows have a vulnerability? Well, now you need to be like, hey guys, there's a 0 day on Windows, and they could get access to the portal that way. If encryption's been breaked, you need to update your encryption. If the firmware, gets reverse engineered and they find a code that makes it that your battery will run out really quickly, well, now you need to, update your firmware and get that out as quickly as possible and notify, people with pacemakers like, yo, update this because, there's a threat. You need to get rid of it real quick.
So I don't know if you'll know the answer to this, but how do they handle those communications? Because, not to stereotype, but a lot of this stuff does typically go into older populations who aren't always best at technology. So how do you explain, to somebody who can barely turn on their smartphone that they need to update this or they need to handle X, Y, Z?
Yeah. So there some of the recommendations are given are A, have the updates be automatic. That's where the signed code comes in. If it's a firmware vulnerability, have your code signed so once it shows up, it updates. And, the device will should still operate while it's updating. Or have, because the devices are given out through hospitals, you can't just go buy a pacemaker and you just have it put in. You shouldn't. I'm sure you could, but you shouldn't. Have the hospitals, have a system that you'd be like, hey, John Hopkins, we have a vulnerability in our thing and we need them to come back to be updated. Okay, then they send it out to their client list like, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, your pacemakers are vulnerable. Please come to the hospital for us to, update it for you.
So.
And then it has to be disclosed to the government saying, hey, our pacemaker had a vulnerability. FDA, we need you to know this so you can update your systems.
So follow-up question again. I don't know if you know the answer to this one. So like when a car recall happens, they send you a notice in the mail. And sometimes it takes months. They're not always great about it. But you can choose to ignore it. You can be like, I don't really care. Like my car at one point had a windshield wiper motor. And I'm like, that is a $20 part. I really don't care. If it goes bad, I'll fix it myself. So are people allowed to deny? Or rather, what liability is there placed on a company if they put out the memo and someone goes, don't feel like it? Or is that kind of not something that's been explored, something you know the answer to?
I'm not sure what the legal repercussions would be. But, like, say, there's vulnerability in a pacemaker. They tell everyone, like, hey, there's a pacemaker. But people don't come in to get it updated. There's a responsibility that they have a way to handle an incident should it happen, like the pacemaker, gets hacked. They have to update all the systems they can. And all of their, forthcoming sales have to have that update in it. But they can't, just hack into your pacemaker to force you to update it. They can't just, remote into Mr. and Mrs. Smith's pacemaker to force them to update to prevent, someone else from remoting it. They can't just do that. They have to have a system that says, we let them know, we told them how they can update it, there's a system in place for it to be updated, Now they just need to start it. If they don't start it, the company can't force, Mr. and Mrs. Smith to update their pacemakers.
Well, I just know that, for example, doctors carry really, really, really high insurance for the reason that there is a slight chance that a patient will die under your care, even if it's completely out of your control. Yeah. So I guess my question is more so asking about, because there are things that are out of your control. To what extent do you know if a company can be held liable? Because it is kind of a life or death medical thing. I know that gets treated very differently than, my windshield wiper motor deciding to not work one day.
Yeah. Again, if they have all the systems in place, I believe they're only liable to their failings. Like, if they didn't notify someone or they didn't have a system in place that, made it easier to get it updated than it, normally would be, then I think they're held liable if there's a failure. But if, no one shows up for a recall, the company can't force you to recall. So I don't know. Again, I don't know the legal repercussions if your pacemaker gets remoted into and you didn't go to an update to get it updated. But I think there is a responsibility if they don't handle it well. Like, if your pacemaker fails and you're like, hey, I almost died, and they're like, sucks, you didn't get the update. It's like, because you didn't tell me about the update, or you said you could get updated. It's not mandatory. It's not a risk. If they lie and say, oh, this isn't a big deal, when every device is affected by it, then they're liable for not
makes
telling
sense.
people.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sorry, I warned everyone. I do have kind of not a lawyer, but my background is kind of the more legal side of things. That's why I was curious about the limitations kind of there.
Yeah, I don't know the legal repercussions. It's not really described in the laws that they pass, like what happens if you fail. It's more like, if you don't have an IR plan on how you're going to deal with a pacemaker failing, well, it's not good. We're going to take action against you. Or you're going to be open to, legal action.
Makes sense.
So, and then once you apply all these regulations, you then have to start the actual process of getting it put into the market, which is a completely different animal, because you have to get it certified, checked, tested, systems checked, different frameworks checked, rechecked, triple checked, introduced, and then, got to continue it throughout the device's life cycle.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you talked about that first week when I was here, or with Ian. I can't remember. You definitely had, addressed that before, though.
Yeah, it's just a whole other level.
So I believe that we kind of cover what we wanted to cover. I'm going to turn to the audience here and ask if anybody's got any questions about either, projects. We'll do our best to answer, although neither of us are, lawyers or doctors.
Yeah. So while we wait for any questions, make sure to check out MCSP and the Leahy Center on LinkedIn. We'd like to thank them both for having our projects, the Leahy Center for hosting us, and Champlain College for teaching us.
Yes. And if you are curious or want to learn more, Mike and I's LinkedIns are also down below if you want some more kind of information about us or project-specific information. We do post weekly, or bi-weekly, I guess now, blogs about, more specific information about our projects.
Yeah, and always feel free to reach out on LinkedIn.
Yes, please do connect with me. So it looks like Ian's asking a question. Is there any story related to the focus on pacemakers?
Pacemakers are just relatively simple to, classify, or it's a lot easier for people to understand because, everyone's generally heard of a pacemaker. It's a fairly common device amongst, that people are familiar with. So just, giving people that framework like, oh, this is what a pacemaker is. Okay, how does that work? Also, a lot of the big stories around medical device security come around pacemakers. Like, I was reading one that the former Vice President Dick Cheney's pacemaker was found to have a severe vulnerability that the company didn't address, like, fairly quickly. Like, they found out about it, I guess, 2002, but didn't address it until 2004. And it was a big deal that the Vice President, lo and behold, has a device in his heart that can be hacked by, state actors.
Oh, fun. Yeah, and I also think it's important, too, that because we have such kind of little time here in these videos, that we do stay more generalized and try to address things that's easy to digest from people who don't have a tech background.
Yeah. Or haven't spent several weeks looking at FIR and MEDSec.
Because, we could definitely get very technical, but we know that it's going to get lost in translation to anybody not familiar or already immersed in the field.
Yeah.
So we'll wait here another, 30 seconds or so, see if anybody pulls through with more questions. But again, thanks everyone for tuning.
So anything else has removed drastically? I guess one device that's not a device in the traditional sense has been software as a medical device. Especially in the EU with the new legislation that just went into effect. It went from a lot of software being Class 1 and Class 2 to being Class 2 and Class 3 because they added another prerequisite to the risk of how much information it's collecting. So like Germany, like I discussed last week, released DIGA, or 2 weeks ago, released DIGA, and almost all DIGAs have to be Class 2 or Class 1. Because they have to make a decision. But that adds another level of risk because if it makes the wrong decision, you get hurt. So software is one that, it's very much between it could go all three classes depending on the software and where it's used and who's using it.
So, while we wait to see if any last-second questions roll in, this is kind of the last individually kind of scheduled video. I believe we are taking a week off, but the goal is now is that we're going to do a big group video, so the 5 of us will all get together, make it, probably an hour-long feature, where we'll speak about more project-specific things, what we learned, how we feel about the internship, kind of like our wrap-up thing, because we do only have 3 weeks left of this internship. And there is a lot of work to be done still. So the goal is that, we'll take some time off, we'll focus in on just, completing up this work, finishing up everything needs to be done, and then we'll come back to you guys, give you the overview, give you kind of the wrap-up, and then, call it a summer, start our I was going to say senior year, but Mike and I are going to be seniors. Ian's already graduated, and I believe Austin's going to his junior year.
Yeah.
So we can focus on the new school year starting.
Yep. All right. Well, I think that's all the questions. Thank you. Our LinkedIn's are, in the description down below. They're also earlier in the presentation. We'd like to thank MCSP, ComCode, and the Leahy Center again. Ian's updated us. He's going into his to get his master's. Well, good luck with that, Ian. The field is made better.
Yes.